Right, welcome to week 8. Biological sciences is our focus for discussion this week. Now, I did a Zoom session this morning, but Kai, I do apologise. You're absolutely right. I've had a failure in audio, and even though I tried to boof it up artificially, it didn't really work. So I'm doing a takeover, and I'll try and remember some wonderful questions that were asked throughout the morning this morning. So let's get started. Biological sciences. Now, I've done the content session this week, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about biological sciences per se. If you want to go back to the content information, do. What I'm going to cover this week is I'm going to start with the digital cards, assessment item 2. Explore some simulation examples. Go over this week's content lecture, skim it pretty quickly. And just remind you, this is part 1 of a 2-part sequence. Biology is too large a strand to teach in one bite. And we want to get you some confidence around teaching it. We don't want to, bash you with biology. We want you to finish up feeling confident teaching it, that you can break it down and chunk it. So for that reason, I've suggested 3 chunks. The first we'll cover today, invertebrates in the school ground, part 1. The second will be studying the adaptive behaviour of small animals in the classroom. And finally, plants in the school environment. Now, if we can look at biology as a strand and say it comprises 3 basic steps, there they are. Loxley breaks them up too into similar bites, and your text for this week, of course, is Loxley, and Loxley's fabulous here with chapters 12, 13 and 14 to be read over the next 2 weeks. Really good practical information in short chapters. Okay, so we can look at biology, we can study it a range of ways, and again, you can see the implications here. These 3 items do connect very much to your digital tasks. Accessing texts, accessing websites, watching television shows. Newspaper articles have a reading age of about 12 years of age, so in order to read some science in the newspaper, and whether it's environmental issues, habitat and species, or agricultural and food issues, you're going to need to have a fair bit of scientific literacy behind you. So it's a good starting place. Keep it local is my recommendation. Too often science, for instance, especially earth and space science, we blow out into strange parts of the world and exceptional events, almost catastrophic events. Let's not catastrophize science. Let's not have the full catastrophe in our classrooms. Let's just have science. Look at science in your classroom, in your school ground, in your community, and once you've established good scientific understandings and connections, then explore and extend. So what we're doing here is we're teaching competence as well. We're teaching confidence as well. So we're going to study the invertebrates initially, adaptive behaviour of small animals, and what we mean study, I'm going to give you some ideas on how to teach these in order to tackle your assessment task 2. And plants will be the focus we finish with next week. So what is the assessment task 2? It's been the topic of a lot of discussion online this week. And so, again, mostly coming from the early childhood teachers because they're caught between a curriculum divide. We've got the early years framework, and then we've got the ACS. Now, the early years framework says really not much about science. It says a lot about play-based learning. It says a lot about early years approaches. And it also has some generic capabilities implied, of reasoning and understanding and observation, and also the use of technology and ICTs. But however, it's pretty quiet on science. So some people are wondering, how do I go about doing it? Well, just go back to the question, okay? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But you've got 2 parts to this question. Part A is an academic part, where you're actually doing 2 bits of pedagogy. You're comparing 2 alternate pedagogies, both with a different curriculum focus. If you're early childhood, you'll be doing 0 to 5 age group plus the 0 to 3 classroom setting with the ACS. If you're a primary teacher, you'll be doing the 0 to 3 primary plus the 5 to 7 or some other variation, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the primary teaching region or area. So you need to describe 2 different pedagogies. And part A, and we had a really good question this morning from Samantha. How do you go about it? It's about 1,000 words long. Do I divide 500 words per pedagogy? Well, no, but you'd need to cover each equally. So for part A, we're expecting what we call a polemic discussion. In other words, it's a circle. The circle it begins with an introduction, and in the introduction you tell us what you're going to tell us. Okay, what subject what strand you're going to be using and approaching, what substrand, okay, if you're a primary teacher, and what elaborations you'll be addressing at what year levels. You'll also then briefly describe your two pedagogies and give a brief rationale for why you're going to use those. Then you get into the introduction section of your paper, where you go and you give a little bit of literature background, a little bit of referencing to established pillars of knowledge. Vygotsky's, for instance, if you're using a certain pedagogical approach, constructivism. You may want to use Piaget if you're looking at cognitive models. You may want to use technology, so you'll be talking about people like Siemens. Okay, there's a whole range of different theorists you may throw in the body of your paper. But what you're doing is you're actually setting up your discussion. So you're saying, okay, you'd split the body into two parts. In part one, you would talk about your first pedagogy and your first pedagogical focus, whether it's early childhood, early years, or primary. The second part of your introduction in the body, you would focus and introduce your second pedagogy, your second focus, and your reasons for employing it. Then you come to the conclusion, the polemic. It closes a full circle. Polemic is circular. Introduction, body, conclusion. The conclusion, tell us what you told us. Okay? I'm about to present two digital cards. Digital cards reflect different pedagogies. The pedagogies are applicable to different learner groups, one at the early childhood, one at the primary school level. I will be targeting at the primary school level this particular strand, substrand, okay, and then dealing with these elaborations. At the early years level, I'll be targeting this particular pedagogy. Tell us what you tell us. So part A is a circular expression, a circular discussion. Introduction, tell us what you're going to tell us. Body, tell us and justify it. Conclusion, tell us what you're about to tell us. Okay, tell us what you told us you're going to tell us. Part A is very important because I use your part A to assess your part B. Because in part A, you're telling me what you're going to do, why you're doing it, and who you're doing it to. I then go to part B, and I look at your digital cards, and I ask myself the question, have you done what you set out to do? Have you actually achieved the pedagogical intent that you set out to achieve in part A? And if they match up, part A and part B, you express your intent and you achieve your intent part B, then you can expect a very good result. But if you can't really get your intent clear in part A, and part B looks a bit wishy-washy, therefore unstructured and ill-formed, then you can expect to be fed back with information along those lines. So you are in control. This is your responsibility. It's an awesome responsibility because you're the person throwing the furniture around. You have to tell us what you're going to tell us, then you have to tell us in part A, and then in your conclusion, tell us what you told us again, just so we're sure when we go to look at your digital cards that we know who we're looking at, we know what we're looking for, and we know why we're looking there. Okay? The cards must be in digital format. Now, it can be as simple as a Word document. You may, for instance, decide to build a blog or a wiki, but you can link to your blog or wiki from a Word document. You can, for instance, put in your digital worksheets can go into your be linked to from your document. You can embed them in a wiki, for instance, or a blog, or you can, for instance, embed them in a document if you know how to do that. You can use Google Docs, okay, and link to documents in Google Docs. But anything you do, if I need to go somewhere and I need to look at your resources, which I will have to do to assess them, and there's any passwords involved or anything like that, please, I will need to know what those passwords are so I can actually access your resources, because I cannot give you credit for resources that I cannot access. So 2 cards. If you're doing early childhood, okay, or prep in Year 3 classroom, the card must be printable, okay, because of the nature of the classroom you're teaching in, okay. And again, if you're doing early childhood, early primary, or primary, link it to science simulations. Have a worksheet, and you are teaching a sequence of learners. And we had Julie point out this morning that I do have a typo here, early tiers curriculum. I did have a typo initially, but I left it in there deliberately, thinking it was a Freudian slip of kinds. So in the blog this week, sorry, on the Q&A, it's kind of a blog, I tell people the task is in two parts, an academic discussion and a digital card. The digital card is going to have two different pedagogies and strands, and these are to be used for Part B. If you're in early childhood, you can't, for instance, have two, you will have two strands, but you won't have reference to two ACS substrands and strands and elaborations. You will have to use pedagogy as your focus. And pedagogy is a very broad term, existed long before the ACS. We've been teaching long before it, you've been teaching early childhood long before it, so please relax, okay? Don't stress. It could be an engagement pedagogy, productive pedagogies, it could be the 5 E's, it could be role plays, narratives, analogies, metaphors. It could be inquiry-based teaching. It could be first-hand investigations, small experiments, problem-based learning, models, data simulations, videos. So an example, in your introduction, okay, in the 0 to 5 card, you may use problem-based learning to teach a biological concept. Your elaborations will tend to be more integrated along the lines of literacy, numeracy, social interaction, play-based learning. And in the P to 3 years, you may explore the 5 E's to teach an aspect of the ACS Earth Sciences substrand scientific understanding. So that's the sort of information we want in your introduction. We want you to point us to it, and we want you to tell us why you're focusing on that, a simple expression of why that is your focus in your introduction. Then in your body, you take us through it step by step, the two pedagogies, split the body in half, deal with each, give us your theoretical framework, give us your background, give us your rationale. Pedagogy 2, give us your theoretical framework, your rationale, and your background. Ideas and simulations. Now, Gregson gives you ideas and lists resources on page 252 to 257. There are, for instance, on our website, on the right-hand side, you've got a block where you've got Glogster, Wikispace, Wix.com. You've got voice software if you want to do some audio and podcasts of your own. All of this stuff can be embedded and linked to from your Word document. Some online simulations that you can link to. FET in Colorado, a really interesting one. Alright, we can get a little bunny hopping on the screen, and we can add a friend. We can add a mutation. And so the mutation will come in the next generation. We can see what happens here to the rabbit species as it grows. We can add more friends. And the bunny's breeding and growing as it comes. Now we can see as the numbers grow, we're going to need more food. So we add some food for the bunnies to actually grow and prosper. And we can see what's happening with the population here and the species. As the more food they get, we're seeing some strong genetic lines. But wait a minute, something's happening. It's dropping off. So what do we do? What do we do quickly? Okay, it's springing up again. And you can see here, this is probably for a higher age. Upper primary, because some of the concepts you can see and what happens with the generational movements. We can see shifts and changes in the populations until ultimately rabbit numbers get quite low. We can see that the brown bunnies have actually extinguished through genetic modification and adaptation, and we can see that the white bunnies have reduced to a fairly sustainable number now, and ultimately heading towards extinction. So it's an interesting game, probably for I would think for upper level primary school. Okay, it's probably a better example. When we look at some of the other games we've got, for instance, plant and animal different. Now we can see this little game, for instance, where we can spot, we can take little photos of birds and we can identify plants and animals. There's a butterfly, for instance. There is a squirrel, not a native to Australia, or some parts of Australia. There are some flowers. Clearly there's a tree with some fruit. What have we got here? There's an ant. And so we can see a little identification game here, which is a nice little game for early childhood, as you can see, or in the 0 to 3 primary school age. So these simulations are all available to you online, and they are free, and they're just an example of some of the things that happen here. Now the really interesting thing is, you get onto some of these sites, particularly the FET site has got lesson plans for you. The New Zealand Science Kids site is just brilliant, okay, because everything is laid out first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, and the New Zealand system is very, very similar to ours. The curriculum is very, very similar. So you will find a great deal of overlap there. So you may want to, as you're putting together your digital task cards, you may want to have a look at some of these simulations and see how they can actually support you in piecing together an exciting, interactive, engaging, and multimodal, importantly, framework that also includes the use of some ICTs, which is really important this day and age. Skimming the content for this week, Kerry and Steppens talk about movement or action as being the main criteria that children use to determine if something is alive. So often as adults we use pretty slack language. The sun is hiding behind the clouds, and kids instantly think, the sun is living. Butterflies and life cycles. Kids, for instance, 0 to 5 and 6, really don't identify that eggs are a source of life. They don't identify, for instance, that pupae, butterfly pupae, are alive. But they do, however, identify butterflies living. Trees also, we find, have got clear categories. And believe it or not, there is a form of research. This is called membership categorization devising. And what it does is basically looks at how people structure knowledge, in this case kids, and their notion of what a living tree is a tree that's fruits or blossoms. A tree that doesn't, up to age about 5 or 6 fruit or blossom, is not considered alive. And the Australian Meat Marketing Federation, for instance, about 4 years ago, did some exciting research into promoting their product to kids, of course, which is a fabulous market. And they actually determined and discovered that less than 40% of kids actually could identify where a sausage came from, what a sausage actually was. Less than 45% of kids actually knew what meat was, that meat was actually a living animal. So they're really interesting concepts, aren't they? And it led Pixar recently to make a movie about all these foods in a fridge which are about to be eaten and killed. So a really interesting notion there of how we address these gaps in scientific knowledge. But as teacher, we need to know when scientific frameworks shift. And therefore we need to change our language, and by changing our language we can change how we structure our teaching, and therefore we can change the interactive world of the student and the learner. So we've got to build up their concept of living organisms by getting the focus on similarities, not differences, okay, which is a really important point. We had a really good question this morning from someone in the early childhood group. How do they actually use, because they don't have an ACS to rely on, well, you take a pedagogy. And for instance, here we've got a nice little example. We'll talk about the fire in a minute. A little example called Tree Friends. A really nice little example. And it fits in there. It's an very express pedagogy. It's a hands-on, tactile pedagogy. Involves taking kids out into a playground. Working in pairs. One child puts a blindfold on another child and spends some time picking out a tree and guides that child gently towards the tree. Now, the child wearing the blindfold has to engage with the tree. It engages through touch. It can feel the bark, the temperature. The other child can lead him around or her around. They can feel the leaves, they can feel the branches, they can feel the sinews, they can smell. Tree friends. They hug the tree to see how wide they think it is, and from there they try to hazard a guess about if it's that wide, then how tall is it. And then they walk back to home base, and the second person takes off the blindfold, and the first student, gets to then walk around the trees and try and identify which was their tree friend. And then, of course, they can collect leaves, they can collect debris, they can collect everything that falls from the trees, they can look at seeds. They can go back and conduct research where they can actually then try to identify the tree, categorize the tree. You can bring in guest speakers, an arborist, okay, someone from the council, anyone who knows something about trees, and they can talk about tree species and which are native, which are not. And you can elaborate and extend study from there. You can then also bring in the bird society, and they can actually come in and identify which species of birds like which species of trees, and which trees attract birds, and which birds they attract. And then you could even set up a bird observation activity to integrate both plants and animals in the local environment. So it's really important to build concepts. That's what we're trying to say here. And even the notion of what does it mean to be alive? Well, kids don't actually have a common view of what it means to be alive. And if the whole notion, how would you suggest a respond to a child who said that fire is alive? Of course you couldn't put them down. You'd have to actually get them to unpack what they meant. And here we've got a little notion that comes from the TILS project. The RILS project in 2011 out of Deakin University. And what they do, they talk about representations in the learning of science, RILS. Now the reason why this is relevant to us is because This is where we started our course, with student representations. And science, basically, we're putting together a whole range of artefacts. And those artefacts are the way the students engage with the world. Earth, fire, sun, virus, a daffodil. Student number 1, it moves, it grows, it lives. You can see a slightly elaborated version of life here. This one says because it changes, a little bit vague. Non-living, fire moves but doesn't live. Living, it runs on fuel and it's full of energy, just like me, you can see. The sun, living like the earth, living because it changes. Virus is living because it attacks your body, and it still lives but after a while it dies. So getting the life cycle here, we can see student number 1 has a more elaborated framework of living creatures than student number 2. And again, that's why it's important to build concepts, because student number 2 can actually learn from student number 1. Student number 1 can help student number 2 refine their own thinking. They can deconstruct some of the poor frameworks that are going on. A freshly picked papaya. You can do this with a tomato. You can do it with a peach. Okay, it's a living experiment. Kids can draw it. They can draw it each day as it deteriorates. Okay, and in the end, the one that's fresh, they can actually eat. So nothing goes to waste here. It's a great learning experience. Okay, but we're looking at the rates of decay. Okay, what happens to same items under different conditions? In other words, a fabulous scientific experiment. Animals, Bell. She did a seminal investigation into the organisms children thought of as animals and why. And cows were pretty clear organisms. Whales, a little more problematic. Didn't think they were an animal. Some people thought they were a fish. Organisms, spiders and worms, no, they're insects. They're not animals. Okay. Interesting, only 25% to 50% of primary school children thought that spiders and worms were animals. Children aged 5 to 6, much more likely to think spiders and worms as animals. Biologists' view. Children aged 8 to 9, or 9 to 10, actually have gained more knowledge of biological groups. So they're starting to split their schema. Okay, they're starting to split concepts, reptiles, insects, types of worm, and therefore they lose the notion of what is an inclusive animal concept. They start to sort, sift and break down. So in that light, I ask you, is focusing on difference the best way to build concepts? And the answer is, it depends on where you're teaching in the curriculum. If you're at the upper end, year 9, 10 and above, then clearly you need to be focusing on differences to try and solidify some of the new frameworks you're building. If, however, you're at 5 and 6, then differences are probably not the best way to go. You probably want to be teaching through a similarities framework, so a nearest neighbour framework. Invertebrates in the school ground, here's the focus of Tytler's study. I'm not going to say too much about that because it's there in the content lecture, but really it's just an elaborated example of how students move from a question to a model. Okay, so it's about invertebrates, and it's the focus of this week's material. Have a look at it, because once you move from that particular concept of what is an invertebrate, where does it live, what examples do we have, predict what they might find, go out and collect from the collection stage, they go to the model building stage. Once they've built the model, they then have a comprehensive understanding of that invertebrate. You can see how embedded and how deep that is. And this model from Tytler would work at any age of the curriculum. Okay. The child is a scientist, PRJ. And again, a really important focus here. 1962, we can actually give the child back the science paradigm. We can give it back to them. All we need to do is step aside. All we need to do is structure the curriculum. All we need to do is come up with relevant pedagogies, and we just have to focus their inquiry. That's all we have to do, and get out of the road. And then be there to pick up the pieces. Help them sort, sift, collect, analyse, evaluate, and reconstruct what they've learned. You don't disappear. You just move from construction to deconstruction to reconstruction. We can reconstruct through learning and reasoning. We can create user-generated questions. Kids, for instance, can observe. Then they can graph and localise. And from there, we can come up with pre-test, post-test response. How many ants do you think an echidna eats? Oh, thousands. Well, actually, on average, as you can see, it's 19 over 3 days. Okay? And kids actually gone back to a much more grounded learning. And this is made possible by multimodal events. textual, physical. We can see here all this stuff we talked about in the last couple of weeks. Venn diagrams, 3D models, animations, simulations, photographs. Cameras are fantastic. Kids can run around their school ground and they can build a photographic portfolio. They can build a gallery of the science around their school. Mathematical, gestural or embodied, role plays, our little tree hugging exercise. All great science, all good pedagogies. Purposeful observation. We can ask students the why question. Why do they move the way they do? Challenge them to conduct scientific observations. They can then go out and they can observe in real detail. The very same things Charles Darwin did. Sketched, drew. Da Vinci sketched and drew. Theorised, hypothesised. And then from there went off. And our kids will come back and build here. They will make sense of their invertebrate understandings by building models. You know, really, really powerful experience. They go from, what are they? What do they look like? What are their features? Why are their features this way? Why are they light brown? Why are they dark brown? What is camouflage? Why is it important? Why do they rely on it? What is their defense system? What do they eat? From there, we can build an exercise, a 3D model of how they actually function and work. This task in Titler, there it is for you. Okay, I won't talk too much about it, but they had to select an invertebrate, so you had to know what it was, classify it from your own habitat, and ultimately, paper, wire, pipe cleaners, elastic, plasticine containers, nothing too fabulous there. Okay, old egg containers are brilliant, cut up, broken, you can make wonderful insects out of those, especially spiders. Very, very simple task and a fun one and relevant to every age. So, Titler talks about working with representations, okay, to build knowledge. And for that reason, we put you through a few hoops this week, just to test your biology. So, you know, we're looking really at a food web here. And here is a food web too. The students actually come up with their own. They've gone from observation, identifying creatures, through to the food web. Well, sorry, they've gone down here secondly, where they've actually gone and charted and mapped the frequency of different creatures. They've then linked those creatures together in a food web, that is, how they actually, you know, relate hierarchically. And from there, they've been able to graph information. They've turned information into knowledge, as you can see. The same with your activities on your food web this week. We asked you to actually get your hands dirty with some questions, some theorising. We talk about adaptive change here. We start to preview what we can talk about next week, theoretically. So you're looking at adaptive change. What happens when one element changes? When oil is spilt into a waterway, when sulphur, when different chemicals are added. Okay, so we can actually explore this with our students, the impact on oxygen, and oxygen, the impact on life. We can do this in schools. Every school has its producers, consumers, and tertiary consumers, the higher order creatures. And we can create pyramids in our schools. We can observe the frequency of these. We can come up with samples. We can identify where they live. We can map our own terrain. And so when we're doing this, we can look, for instance, the different activities that you can use in a science. When you're putting together your activity task 2, you know, you're putting together a Word document, and that Word document is essentially a digital card, and that digital card is going to be made up of activities, and those activities are going to have to be embedded in science understandings. Okay, we're also going to have science inquiry skills at their heart, and those inquiry skills don't come out of nowhere. We have certain values that we want our students to actually adopt, recognise and acknowledge. So when you're doing assessment task 2, okay, why not do biology? Because we're doing it as we go. You can collect resources now. You can look at all of the, you know, the things available to you. You can start to think about what activities you're going to do, the conceptual understandings you're going to build, the inquiry skills you're going to develop, and the values and attitudes that you're going to embed. And the final point for this week was that once you've done it all, bring it back to the classroom. Bring it back to the classroom. You know, Robert Bly is a famous poet, and he tells amazing stories, you know, that, you know, go back to the Brothers Grimm, that really have faded from the planet and faded from popular telling. And every time he finishes the story, he puts himself in the story and then says, and when I was there they gave me this, and I was going to bring it here with you today, but when I got out of my car I dropped it and broke it. And so people come from the story, they come back to the present. So it's really the same thing with science. You've now got to turn the student, the child as a scientist, okay, you've got to now turn them back in, convert them, reconstruct them as a learner, bring them back to the classroom. And you can do that with mini terrestrial habitats. You know, get them into groups and get them to build a little habitat model. Okay? And there, they can demonstrate all of their feeding relationships. They can extend and answer any questions and you can interview them. Or they may shoot a video where they demonstrate to someone, to an audience, to parents, or their family, or to another class. They can shoot a video where they demonstrate the features of their habitat. So we're tied into TPACK this week. You'll have a look at this task. Assessment Task 2 asks you to think about turning your skills as a teacher into a technology resource. So you're going to need some technology skills. You're going to do that by building on your content knowledge. Okay, most of you have been, dealing with Queensland curriculum for quite a while now, or with your own state's curriculum for quite a while now. So you're building your content knowledge. You're far from an expert, okay, but you're certainly at the apprentice stage. The pedagogical knowledge also, you have enough apprenticeship experience behind you. What we're doing in this task now is getting you to bring these three domains together. Technology can support content and can support pedagogy. And you're going to show us how in Assessment Task 2. It's that simple. Next week, there'll be no Zoom session in week 9, unfortunately. I'll be away from campus, but I will be available online, so I'll be answering questions as they come through the Q&A. I'm going to be talking about two clear foci next week. One, studying the adaptive behaviour of small animals in the classroom, the second stage of biology. Invertebrates is the first, and I think we've covered enough of that today. Knowing what's living, what's not, knowing what's an animal, what categories are, when to scaffold and teach these is another important issue. Next week we're looking at adaptive behaviours. And again, Loxley covers this really well. He's got a whole chapter on adaptation. Focus 2, plants in the school environment, is, again, Loxley does this in chapters 13 and 14, okay, where he looks at plant adaptation. So he subsumes both animals and plants together. Have a good look. And Loxley is not a he, Loxley is a they. So they've done a very good job with these texts. They're very short, very practical, and they will ground your focus for this week. And more importantly, ground you to complete assessment task number 2. Alright, I look forward to any questions that may come from the forum, and please keep them coming. Thank you.